Welcome back. I'm now joined in our Pretoria studio by Dr. Vuyokazi Mahlati, who chaired the Land Reform Review Panel. The panel submitted its report to President Cyril Ramaphosa most recently. And, of course, the report is out there for members of the public to comment on. So, Doc, thank you very much. Just tell me a little bit about the amount of work that you had to put in to compile this report. Of course, different investigations had been made before. There were public consultations by Parliament, and we also have the Land Department. I'm sure you used their reports. Just tell me a little bit about the amount of information that you had to delve into to compile your report.
Well, you're right. I mean, that was a big part of what we had to do. Thanks so much, Tim, for inviting me on behalf of the panel to share our recommendations here. The big part of the work was the analysis of existing information, secondary data, as they would say. And this was in form of research, reports, and also direct engagements within government with the heads of departments, the various departments that are involved in land reform within the interministerial committee of government, as well as meeting with the Land Claims Commissioner, as well as the Valuer General. So it was basically a whole host of sources within government, and then we had to go outside of that. As you say, there was also already a process, and we like to make the distinction that our process is distinct from the parliamentary process. Our process basically was not questioning whether expropriation without compensation happens or doesn't happen, as the process was already done by the parliamentary process. We were specifically given instructions through our terms of reference, and these instructions were to look at the conditions in terms of how this can happen. So we realized that we needed to pull from all these sources, including Parliament, to have a sense of what the issues have been. But we felt it was important, and also our terms of reference instructed us to engage in consultations. So we engaged in consultations, and these had to cover a cross-section of society. We looked in terms of various bodies that are critical, and we had 2 colloquia, because we felt it was, instead of engaging just on a one-on-one, we must also have, a platform, which we used in terms of the colloquium, where we had a cross-section of people listen to them, raising their issues, and they would involve civil society, academics, government officials, private sector, in sort of one room. And that was very useful. We had over 200 to 300 people in these colloquia. We had 2 of them. And then from there, we realized, okay.
Sorry, let me interrupt you there and find out from you what the main findings were. Of course, we know the history of dispossession, land dispossession in the country, and the impact that that has had on the life of South Africans, especially the majority African people, right? And that's partly the reason why the call has been made, and people continue to agitate for this, that there has to be expropriation without compensation. Now, from all the consultations that you've had and the reports that you've read, what were your main findings?
Well, the findings were basically what we understood before, but now with more detail. The critical issue was that land hunger is a problem. When people talk about land hunger, it is an issue that affects both urban and rural areas. We also recognize through the findings that previously a mistake has been made to link land reform just with agriculture and not focused on urban land reform. And this has had its dire consequences, because from an urban perspective, we find ourselves with a crisis where, if we include peri-urban, we have around 80% of the urban population residing on 2% of the land. So when we looked at the issue, we went further to look at the strategies that dealt with this from an urban perspective, and found that there was focus mainly on the housing delivery. And that also being sort of part of the Constitution in terms of housing. We recognize that the link between housing from a human settlement perspective, as addressed within the Constitution in Section 26, has to be aligned to Section 25 of the Constitution, which is more instructive as far as land reform is concerned. So those were some of the issues, and then we go further within the rural space to appreciate, the issues that are very problematic from the targets that were set, mainly focusing on the transfer of agricultural land, commercial, with a target of 30% by 2014, and recognize that we are far from reaching that. And the fact that, broadly speaking, the focus of land reform has been on land restitution. And it's important for the public to appreciate the different types, because the legislation of 1997, National Land Policy, articulates very clearly the three pillars which deal with land restitution.
Yes.
Which focuses directly on those people who have been dispossessed, who can basically claim the land that they have proof that it was dispossessed. And then it goes further to deal with issues of redistribution, which is not necessarily, with redistribution, with restitution, you are having the proof the burden of proof is with the person who's claiming. With redistribution, you don't have to prove that you were basically dispossessed, but it is a situation that addresses landlessness in our country, particularly now, from an
Dr.
area
Mahlati,
of equity.
What did you find in as far as the land restitution program went? I mean, it started, you say, from 1997, thereabouts. What did you find? How much money was spent, and who got what where? How successful, or what were the difficulties that they met with over time, over that period of time, trying to restore land to those who had been previously dispossessed?
Okay, this has been the big part of land reform. Basically, it has focused on that. And the findings, we recognize that there were over 80,000 claims that were submitted. And this is in terms of the deadline of December 1998. And from those, we are sitting with around 5,000 claims that have not been resolved, but have been verified. And the complexity is basically the fact that within those claims, the 5,000 plus that are outstanding, the cost of addressing those claims within the current frame in terms of legislation and processes, it could cost around 27 billion rands. That was the figure that we were given by the department. So these are the claims that are still to be resolved.
So how much money was spent over that period of time to settle the other claims? And was land restored to the original owners, or was money paid out? Because I'm sure there's a lesson to be learned from that approach of the 1997 policy.
There are big lessons to be learned, but the bigger issue here is that it's a combination. It's a combination of people who were resettled back to the land that they claimed, but other people who were paid, who were compensated who preferred that route. It's a complex process in the sense that land reform is not just about, when you ask how much, it's not just about how much was spent by a particular department or the Land Claims Court specifically. Because one of the problems that we identified was the fact that the transfer of land does not actually, there are problems because you transfer land back to the owners, but the issue is that that land requires further planning and development. The case that we are finding right now in terms of districts are some of those cases. So there's further planning and development that is required, in terms of ensuring that you've got successful land reform. And in some of the areas, the land rights are not aligned, for instance, on the agricultural side, are not aligned to the water rights, because the water rights were to the individual farmer as opposed to the land. So you gain the land, but you don't gain the important resource that you require. You still have to go through a process. So a whole lot of issues of support, post-settlement support, that basically become a big issue. And the fact that the Land Claims Commission and the Land Claims Court, the key pillars in terms of ensuring our restitution, do not have the right resources. And what we're pushing for is basically to make sure that we start by resourcing them, because to some degree they've managed to do a lot of work, but they need further resources and ensure that we have a permanent judges as far as the Land Claims Court. And we're even actually proposing a restructuring of the Land Claims Court into a land court. So it's a whole realm of issues that require reconfiguration to address the current problems, but also lessons that we're learning from them.
Well, in a moment, I'm going to continue our conversation with Dr. Vuyokazi Mahlati, and we are discussing the recommendations in their report that's been submitted to government. They've conducted studies, they've held consultations, and we'll look at the extent to which this will restore land to the people. Remember, the call was for land to be expropriated without compensation, and that following such a move, this land has to be nationalized. How far do they go with their recommendations? We're asking you to be part of our conversation. Join us on social media, the hashtag, the Modise Network, and we will be continuing with this conversation in a short while.